They thought they were untouchable, but the woman they arrested had the power to change everything. The hum of Valerie's luxury sedan was the only sound accompanying her as she drove home late that evening. The suburban streets of Anaheim Hills were calm, the kind of calm that could deceive you into believing the world was at peace. Valerie Chambers, a respected judge with over 2 decades on the bench, was mentally replaying the day's court proceedings, as she often did during her nightly drives. She'd spent the day deliberating on a high-profile case, her mind focused, her judgment sharp. But tonight, the weariness tugged at her shoulders. She thought about her daughter's upcoming graduation, the speech she still needed to prepare, and the promise she'd made to herself to take a break once this case wrapped up. Life was hectic but good, until blue and red lights flickered in her rearview mirror. Her brows furrowed as she slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road. She wasn't speeding, hadn't skipped a signal. She reached for her purse, where her driver's license and registration were neatly stored. The reflection of the patrol car's lights danced on her dashboard as 2 officers approached from behind. One tapped on the driver's side window with a force that felt unnecessarily aggressive. "Evening, ma'am. License and registration," the taller officer barked, his tone devoid of courtesy. Valerie handed over her documents without hesitation. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer's partner leaned in, his flashlight sweeping across the car's interior. "We'll ask the questions," he muttered. Valerie's professional instincts told her to remain calm, to not escalate what already felt like a hostile interaction. "Of course, officers," she replied, keeping her voice steady. But the next few moments unfolded like a scene from a bad television drama. Questions turned into accusations, accusations into thinly veiled threats. Valerie attempted to explain. Her career, her purpose for being on the road at this hour, but the officers didn't care. To them, she was just another driver to be intimidated, another person to assert their authority over. Something felt wrong, but Valerie couldn't place her finger on it. Still, she stayed composed, knowing this was only the beginning. The taller officer, whose name tag read Reynolds, stepped back, flipping through Valerie's documents with a deliberate slowness that felt more like a performance than procedure. His partner, a stocky man with a shaved head named Officer Daniels, stayed close, his flashlight now trained directly on Valerie's face. "Mind telling us what you're doing out here so late?" Daniels asked, his tone teetering on condescension. Valerie inhaled deeply, choosing her words carefully. "I'm heading home. I had a late night at work." Reynolds smirked, glancing up from her license. "Late night, huh? What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a judge," she said, meeting his gaze. Her tone wasn't boastful, it was matter-of-fact. But instead of respect, her words were met with skepticism. "A judge?" Daniels chuckled, shaking his head. "That's a new one." Valerie felt her stomach tighten. She'd seen this play out before, not with her, but with others. The dismissiveness, the disbelief. It was all too familiar. She kept her expression neutral, though her heart was beginning to race. Reynolds leaned closer, his smirk growing wider. "You got any proof of that, Judge? Or should we skip the formalities and get to the part where you tell us what you're really up to?" "Proof?" Valerie repeated, her voice calm but firm. "Officers, I've complied with everything you've asked. I've handed you my license and registration. If there's an issue, I'd like to address it." Reynolds didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed her documents to Daniels and motioned toward the back of the car. "Step out of the vehicle." For a moment, Valerie considered refusing. She knew her rights, knew they had no valid reason to escalate the situation further, but she also knew the risk of standing her ground. With a composed sigh, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out into the cool night air. Daniels moved closer, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Turn around," he ordered. "Excuse me?" Valerie asked, her voice betraying a hint of disbelief. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "You're detaining me?" Valerie asked, the weight of the moment sinking in. On what grounds? Reynolds shrugged, his smirk now a full-blown grin. Suspicious behavior. We'll sort it out at the station. Valerie's heart pounded in her chest as she felt cold metal clamp around her wrists. The humiliation was visceral, raw. She wanted to protest, to remind them of who she was, but something stopped her. They didn't care. They weren't interested in the truth, only in the narrative they had already constructed. As she was guided toward the back of the patrol car, a small crowd began to gather. Neighbors peeked through windows, a few stepping onto their porches to watch. Valerie caught the eye of an older man in a robe and slippers, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. She didn't dare speak, didn't dare look away. She simply allowed herself to be placed in the back seat, her head held high despite the ache of humiliation creeping in. The drive to the station was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Valerie stared out the window, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She thought of her daughter, her colleagues, the countless people who looked up to her as a beacon of justice. How would they react to this? What would this mean for her career, her reputation? But even amidst the flood of emotions, one thought stood out. They didn't know who she was. Not yet. The night was far from over, but Valerie's resolve only grew stronger. She knew this was a battle she couldn't afford to lose, not for herself, but for every person who had ever been in her shoes. The holding cell was small and cold, the kind of space that seemed to leach warmth from the soul. Valerie sat on the bench, her hands still cuffed, her wrists beginning to ache from the tight metal. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to let the officers see her discomfort. They had taken her belongings, phone, purse, even her watch, and left her in silence, as if hoping to break her resolve. Minutes felt like hours. Valerie's mind raced with questions, fears, and a growing sense of determination. She knew she wasn't the first black woman to be treated this way, but she was determined to ensure she'd be one of the last. She mentally catalogued every interaction, every word spoken, and every action taken since the moment she was pulled over. These details would matter later, of that she was certain. Through the bars she could see the officers laughing, their voices carrying into the dimly lit corridor. She really thinks she's someone important, Daniels joked, his voice loud and mocking. Reynolds joined in with a comment Valerie couldn't make out, but the laughter that followed made it clear it wasn't flattering. She closed her eyes, drawing on every ounce of patience and strength she had cultivated over her years on the bench. Suddenly, a commotion broke her thoughts. A door slammed, and a commanding voice echoed through the station. "What's going on here?" Valerie turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of a man in a sharp suit. It was one of her colleagues, District Attorney Michael Harrington. He was a relentless advocate for justice and someone who had worked alongside Valerie on numerous cases. His face, usually calm and collected, was now a mask of fury. "Judge Chambers," he called out, spotting her in the cell. "What in the world is this?" Reynolds and Daniels immediately stiffened, their earlier bravado evaporating. It's just a routine." "Routine?" Harrington cut him off, his voice like a whip. "You arrested a sitting judge? On what grounds?" The room fell silent. Valerie remained seated, her face betraying none of the emotions churning inside her. She wanted to speak, but she knew Harrington could handle this better than anyone. Daniels stammered, She was acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" Harrington repeated, his voice dripping with incredulity. "Do you even understand what you've done, or are you too blinded by your assumptions to see it?" Reynolds stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. "We were just doing our job, sir." "Your job?" Harrington snapped. "Your job is to uphold the law, not violate it." Valerie watched as the balance of power shifted in the room. For the first time that evening she felt a glimmer of hope. Harrington's presence was a reminder that the truth still mattered, that justice could still prevail. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. After what felt like an eternity, the officers reluctantly unlocked the cell. As the door swung open, Valerie stood, her posture as dignified as ever. She met Harrington's gaze, nodding her thanks, before turning to face the two officers. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I trust we'll be seeing each other again soon." The weight of her words hung in the air as she walked out of the station, her head held high. The humiliation of the evening still clung to her, but so did her resolve. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, mistreated, or dismissed. And she wasn't about to let it go. As she stepped into the cool night air, Harrington by her side, Valerie allowed herself a small smile. The officers didn't know it yet, but their actions had set something much larger in motion. But even as she left the station, Valerie knew the real fight was just beginning. She wasn't going to let this end with her release. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet chatter as the officers entered, their confidence restored by the knowledge that they'd face only a disciplinary hearing. Officer Reynolds and Officer Daniels walked side by side, their postures upright, their faces smug. They exchanged quick glances, clearly unconcerned about the outcome. After all, they had their defense prepared. She was just a driver acting suspiciously, nothing more. The courtroom itself was modest, with polished wood paneling and rows of seats filling with spectators. To the officers, it was just another room in the justice system, a place where people like them always seemed to hold the upper hand. But as they approached the front of the room, something caught their attention. A murmur swept through the crowd, the kind of shift in energy that made people sit a little straighter. When the bailiff announced, "All rise," the officers were still oblivious. They stood respectfully, hands clasped in front of them, waiting for the judge to enter. Then the doors to the chambers opened, and Judge Valerie Chambers stepped inside, her black robe billowing slightly as she ascended the bench. Reynolds and Daniels froze. Their faces, once smug, turned ashen. Daniels blinked as if trying to reconcile the image of the woman they'd handcuffed days earlier with the authority figure now sitting before them. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as he glanced at his partner. Neither spoke. Valerie took her seat, her expression unreadable, her movements deliberate. She surveyed the room briefly before speaking. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but authoritative. "This court is now in session. We are here to address allegations of misconduct by Officers Reynolds and Daniels. Let us proceed." The tension in the room was palpable. Valerie's composure was unshakable, but beneath it was a storm of emotions. She had waited for this moment, not out of vengeance, but because she understood the weight of accountability. Today wasn't about personal vindication, it was about something much larger. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda Avery, presented the case against the officers. She detailed their actions, from the unjustified stop to the baseless arrest, using evidence from body cam footage and witness statements. The footage played on a screen, showing the officers' dismissive tones and unnecessary escalation. Gasps rippled through the room as the video captured the moment Valerie calmly identified herself as a judge, only to be ignored. Reynolds squirmed in his seat, his earlier confidence shattered. Daniels avoided eye contact with anyone, his hands gripping the edges of the table. When it was Valerie's turn to address the room, she removed her glasses and leaned slightly forward. Her voice was steady, measured. "Officers Reynolds and Daniels," she began, "this is not about me. This is about the trust that society places in its law enforcement, a trust that you, through your actions, have violated." Her words were precise, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. She spoke not as a victim, but as a judge, laying out the broader implications of their behavior. "Your actions on that night were not just an affront to me as an individual. They were an affront to every person who expects fairness and respect from those sworn to protect and serve. The officers shifted uncomfortably as Valerie continued. She wasn't angry, at least not outwardly. Instead, she exuded a quiet strength that made every word hit harder. The room hung on her every sentence, the weight of her presence impossible to ignore. The officer's defense attorney attempted to argue that Reynolds and Daniels had acted out of caution, citing vague concerns about potential threats. But Valerie wasn't swayed. Caution, she said, does not excuse prejudice. Fear does not excuse misconduct. And assumptions based on appearances have no place in the fair administration of the law. By the end of the hearing, the officer's arrogance had dissolved entirely. They sat with shoulders slumped, faces pale, as Valerie prepared to deliver her ruling. She didn't berate them or humiliate them. Instead, she issued a thoughtful yet firm decision, one that held them accountable while emphasizing the need for systemic change. "In my courtroom," she said in closing, "justice is not a privilege reserved for a few. It is a right, and it is my duty to uphold it, without bias, without exception." Her words were met with a wave of quiet murmurs and nods from the audience. Even those who might have doubted her before could see that this wasn't just about a personal grievance. It was about justice, fairness, and the kind of accountability that could inspire change. But even as Valerie adjourned the court, she knew the work wasn't over. True justice wasn't achieved in a single ruling. It was built, day by day, through actions and accountability. The courtroom emptied slowly, murmurs of disbelief and reflection echoing through the space. Valerie remained seated at the bench for a moment longer, watching as Reynolds and Daniels shuffled out, their once commanding presence reduced to silence. She felt no triumph in their discomfort, only a quiet hope that this moment might plant the seed for their growth. As she returned to her chambers, she was greeted by Linda Avery, the prosecutor. "You handled that with remarkable grace," Linda said, her admiration evident. Valerie offered a small smile in response, but her mind was already elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the countless other stories like hers, those who never had their voices heard or their injustices addressed. Later that evening, Valerie sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea in hand. Her daughter, Eleanor, entered the room, still wearing her college hoodie. "I saw the news," Eleanor said, setting her phone down. "You were incredible today." Valerie gave a tired chuckle. "It's not about being incredible. It's about doing what's right." Eleanor sat across from her, a thoughtful look on her face. "But not everyone would have handled it the way you did. A lot of people would have been angry, deservedly so." "I was angry," Valerie admitted. "But anger alone doesn't fix things. It's what you do with that anger that matters. I needed to show them, not just the officers but everyone watching, that justice isn't about revenge. It's about accountability and fairness, no matter who's involved." Elena nodded, her expression softening. "You think they'll learn from this?" "I hope so," Valerie said. "But whether they do or not, I have to keep trying. We all do." The next day, Valerie received an unexpected call. It was from one of the community leaders in Anaheim Hills, inviting her to speak at an upcoming forum about bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Though she hesitated at first, Valerie eventually agreed. She knew that real change required more than rulings from the bench. It required conversations, education, and persistent effort. When the day of the forum arrived, Valerie stood before a packed auditorium. Officers, community members, and local leaders filled the seats, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Valerie shared her story, not as a judge, but as a person who had experienced the sharp edge of bias. She spoke candidly about the importance of empathy, understanding, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. By the time she finished, the room was silent, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. A young officer approached her afterward, his expression earnest. "Your story. It made me think about how I do my job. I want to do better." Valerie smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's all anyone can ask. Just remember, every choice you make has the power to change someone's life. Use that power wisely." As Valerie left the auditorium that evening, she felt a rare sense of peace. The events of the past week had been exhausting, but they had also been a reminder of why she chose this path in the first place. Justice wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was worth fighting for. Because in the end, justice is more than a system. It's a promise we make to each other. And it's up to all of us to keep that promise alive. If this story made you reflect on the importance of accountability and fairness, share it with someone who might benefit from hearing it. Let's continue the conversation and work toward a world where justice truly is for everyone. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories that challenge and inspire us all.